1914, when the first shots were fired, Europe led the way in everything. In 1945, when the guns fell silent, the world was bankrupt and exhausted. Across 3 decades in which empires crumbled, new players with new ideologies emerged. A world centuries in the making had been dismantled by a world war. The news of the Archduke's assassination reached London at the height of the Irish crisis and feminist agitation, said Colonel Edward House, US President Woodrow Wilson's special envoy for Europe, and it created no more audible effect than a tenor solo in the boiler shop. The assassination in question was that of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. An event that ripened into a war that took more than 10 million lives, and is tied to a second, 25 years later, that claimed between 8 and 10 times that number.
I think the 30 years from 1914 to 1945 really is one period. It has a kind of, in a sense, unity of theme.
History does remind us that this was a long period, a period that embraced the lifetimes of many people, in which were just continuous and almost back-to-back and consecutive crises of major proportions.
The period from 1914 to 1945 was a period of imperial disruption and reordering. When the general European war breaks out in 1914, we're looking at a world that is dominated by empires.
At the center of the World War were the same nations, the same battlefields. A violent conflict that collapsed empires, bankrupted states, dethroned monarchs, and promoted new ideologies. There is a wistful thought that in 1914, Europe flung itself off a cliff, that war tumbled from a clear blue sky. It was not so.
It might be the case that Europe was a house of cards in 1914, but it still took someone to give that card table a nudge and watch all the cards fall down.
Within the great powers, 3 imperial dynasties dominated. The Romanovs in Russia, the Hohenzollern in Germany, which had been a unified nation for less than 50 years, and the Habsburgs.
The Habsburgs, one of the dominant royal families in Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century. They had accumulated a patchwork of territories, partly through war, but largely through very carefully arranged marriages.
When Prussia defeated France in 1870 to 71, and the Prussian monarch became Kaiser of a united Germany, the balance of power in Europe tilted sharply.
Everybody said in 1871 Prussia will dominate Germany, and it did, but it also disappeared in Germany. So Prussia became Germany.
Germany was a federal state, 26 different states of various sizes, many with their own local nobles, all with their own history, 4 of them with their own kings.
After unification, the King of Prussia, Wilhelm II, was made emperor, Kaiser, of all of them. He was Queen Victoria's grandson and cousin of King George V, who in turn was cousin of the autocratic Tsar of all the Russias, Nicholas II. Despite these family bonds, peace, the German ambassador in Paris said, remains at the mercy of an accident. And the most likely place for an accident that would disturb the peace was the Balkans, a perennial battlefield where Habsburgs ruled over Slavs in territory they had captured from the Turks. The Austrian emperor was an old man who had been on the throne since 1848. More than 60 years, during which the world had changed and the threats to his empire had magnified.
One of the things that the Habsburg rulers and political elite really feared was pan-Slavism.
As early as 1838, a Russian historian wrote to the Tsar that Slavs are bound to us in spiritual unity by origin and language, despite geographical and political separation. The greatest threat to the integrity of the Habsburg Empire was Slav nationalism, and that threat was made palpable on June 28, 1914.
Bosnia-Herzegovina was part of the Ottoman Empire and lay to the west of Serbia, basically between Serbia and the sea. And the Habsburg Empire annexed this territory from the Ottomans in order to prevent the Serbians from getting access to the sea.
Attempting to shore up support in their newly acquired territory, the Habsburgs sent Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to Sarajevo.
This was part of a project to tie the newly annexed province of Bosnia into the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. Franz Ferdinand was sent not only because he was the heir to the throne, but also because he was a well-known advocate of greater Slavic participation in Austro-Hungarian politics.
But there were those in the crowd for whom participation was not enough. Their cause was Slav nationalism, prizing Bosnia from the grip of the Habsburg monarchy.
Franz Ferdinand, who unwisely decides to visit Sarajevo on the anniversary of the assassination of a leader, a Serb leader, several centuries before, which obviously is provocative. Now, the conspirators, I think there are 7 assassins altogether, they are assisted in getting across the border from Serbia into Bosnia-Herzegovina to enact their plot against the Archduke.
Armed with pistols and bombs, the 7 would-be assassins positioned themselves along the Archduke's route from the train station to the town hall. The Archduke's procession passed 2 of the conspirators without event, before 19-year-old Nedeljko Čebrinović threw his bomb. But Čebrinović missed the target car. Hearing the bomb and assuming the deed done, Čebrinović's co-conspirator, Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old consumptive Bosnian Serb student, wandered off to grab a sandwich at Moritz Schiller's cafe on Gabet Street. Despite this bomb attempt, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand's procession continued, and they made their way to the town hall for a civic reception and speeches before beginning the return leg of their tour. Which is where Princip was when, doubtless to his amazement, he was confronted by the target vehicle having taken a wrong turn.
It's rather a farcical plot until eventually it succeeds, because there is the most famous wrong turn in history.
I do not remember what I thought, he said. I know only that I fired twice, or perhaps several times, without knowing whether I hit or missed. because at that moment the crowd began to beat me. Princip did not miss. The Archduke was dead within minutes.
When Franz Ferdinand is assassinated, there really isn't that much of a response from many of the Western powers. Most of them haven't really heard of this fellow. And when they do learn about who he was, they tend to write this off as a Balkan thing.
It was, as far as all of Europe was concerned, another assassination in an age where political violence was almost routine. You could be forgiven for thinking that one more victim would cause only minor ripples, and most people did think that. But for some, this was an opportunity.
Austria-Hungary thought that it is completely undermined by terroristic activities from nationalist Serbia, and that they had to step in to stop that, because if not, the consistency and the strength of Austria-Hungary was compromised.
The fallout from the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and the various diplomatic measures taken from interested parties is known as the July Crisis. Critical decisions that would decide if there would be war or peace were taken by just a handful of men.
Individual personalities played a critical role in the July Crisis. This was a crisis in which a small number of men made the critical decisions about war and peace. To take just one example, the person of Franz Ferdinand. In previous crises, Franz Ferdinand had been an advocate of peace, an advocate of compromise, but now his voice was removed from the scene by his murder, and his murder itself had become an excuse for war. The Austro-Hungarian leaders had different motivations, different attitudes in 1914. For some, they believed that war against Serbia would prevent the Serbian challenge to the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. A dangerous element of thinking within Vienna in 1914, particularly amongst the military. Some of them believed that the Austro-Hungarian Empire was doomed, but given that it was doomed, it was better to go down in a fight than to slide peacefully off the pages of history.
On the evening of the 28th of June, Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf, Austro-Hungarian Chief of Staff, wrote, "It will be a hopeless struggle, but it must be pursued, because so old a monarchy and so glorious an army cannot go down ingloriously." But Conrad's focus was split between his love of country and his forbidden love affair.
There was also a personal dimension to this. Conrad was in love with a married woman, Gina von Reininghaus, and in the mores of Viennese high society, it was impossible for him to marry this woman. But in his fantasies, he believed that a military victory would enable him to overcome these customs and for them to marry.
With the world on the precipice of war, Conrad devoted much energy on his schoolboy crush. He wrote, "Should I, what I shyly dare to hope, return crowned by success, then, Gina, I shall break all bonds in order to conquer you." In London, a similarly infatuated Herbert Asquith, the British Prime Minister, confided in daily letters to Venetia Stanley, 35 years his junior and the object of his affection. In such hands was the future of Europe, perhaps the world. Friday, July 3rd, was Franz Ferdinand's funeral. Not a single foreign royal or statesman traveled to Vienna for the event. Count István Tisza de Boroshenú a Szeged, Minister-President for Hungary, wrote, "Serbia will hardly give us just grounds for warlike measures, and without them, it would be an inexcusable mistake to enter upon such a war."
And there's a theory at the moment, which is very popular, that really no one state was principally to blame for the outbreak of the war. Well, I don't buy that, actually. I think there are two principal drivers of the war. The first is Austria-Hungary, and the second is Germany.
Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria-Hungary, wrote to the Kaiser, "The attack directed against my poor nephew is the direct consequence of the agitation carried on by the Russian and Serbian pan-Slavists, whose sole aim is the destruction of my empire."
Well, Austria-Hungary is allied to Germany, which is by far the stronger power. So it really can't take any major action on the international stage without having Germans say so.
From an Austro-Hungarian point of view, they wanted to have the final reckoning with Serbia, and they were so believing in German strength that they thought if it escalates, Germany will win for us.
The German Chancellor sent a telegram to Franz Joseph replying, "The Emperor may rest assured that His Majesty will faithfully stand by Austria-Hungary, as is required by the obligations of his alliance and of his ancient friendship." History knows that telegram as the blank check.
The Kaiser famously issues a blank check to the Austro-Hungarians, which effectively means they can manage the crisis themselves, they can do whatever they wish.
The Germans issued the blank check to the Viennese based on two assumptions, neither of which turned out to be correct. The first assumption was that Austria-Hungary would take quick and decisive military action against Serbia. And the second assumption, at least in the early days of July 1914, was that Russian leaders could not possibly back Serbia in this particular context. After all, how could a conservative monarchy like Russia back a regicidal regime in Serbia? Or at least that was the rationale of German leaders.
It's difficult to see how a conflict in the Balkans could be confined to the Balkans, because Serbia's protector is Russia. Russia is in alliance with France, and so you see there's the possibility of the war spreading very quickly.
And that tends to be the story throughout this period of trying to suppress clashing nationalisms, clashing ethnicities, and managing the collapse of three empires.
The report of the official Austrian commission into Sarajevo determined that there is nothing to prove or even support the view that the Serbian government was concerned in inciting the crime, preparing for it, or providing the weapons used. That was not what Vienna wanted to hear, so they didn't hear it.
In 1914, they said every agreement, declaration of friendship, and so on with Serbia is completely worthless because the Serbs will not stick to their word. And the only language they understand is violence.
On Monday, July 20th, the President and Premier of France arrived in St. Petersburg on a state visit. Alliances were to be formed and some solidified. The alliance between France and Russia, which, with British involvement, was known as the Triple Entente. The Triple Alliance, joining Germany to Austria and Italy, was the counterweight.
There was a conflict of interest between Italy and Austria-Hungary. So, for example, they both had designs on similar territory in the Balkan and the Balkan regions. Also within Austria-Hungary, there were Italian-speaking provinces of Trento and Trieste, which Italy and certain sectors within Italian society wanted to reintegrate into the Italian nation. So there were significant sources of conflict and tension between Italy and Austria-Hungary, so it was not a perfectly harmonious alliance. Also, in the decade leading up to the outbreak of the First World War, there had been a gradual rapprochement with both France and Britain and Italy. So again, France and Britain had both ultimately left Italy a free hand in its invasion of Libya in 1911. So this was significant that there were reducing tensions with the powers of France and Britain and this continuing conflict of interests between the allies of Austria-Hungary.
"4 days before the war started, the German Under-Secretary of State declared, 'Everything is the fault of this damned system of alliances.'"
Britain and the wider British Empire is not formally allied to France or Russia, but in an understanding with it, an entente with Russia and France. So the potential for the war spreading is very obvious. So the Austrians take the deliberate decision to go ahead to punish the Serbs in the full knowledge of what is likely to occur.
On July 19th, Austria had finalized an ultimatum to be presented to Serbia, delivery of which was deliberately delayed until the 23rd, when it was known that the French president had completed his state visit and was at sea.
Germany and Austria-Hungary took that moment as an opportunity to force their demands on Serbia when France wasn't in a position to make an active diplomatic contribution.
The ultimatum threatened war unless Serbia complied with what were, by design, unacceptable terms.
It is an act of brinkmanship, I think an act of recklessness which plunges Europe into war.
On July 25th, Alexander, the Prince Regent of Serbia, sent a telegram to the Tsar of Russia. "In these difficult moments, I voice the sentiments of the Serbian people, who supplicate your Majesty to interest himself in the lot of the Kingdom of Serbia." But the situation within Russia was not that simple. War would place a heavy burden on the resources of the empire that could have drastic consequences.
There was rising tensions in Russia's urban spaces. The worker populations of the cities were increasingly involved in labour activism. There was a lot of talk about tension, a crisis in Russia, and the risk of revolution again. It's coming from concerns about living standards going down, and also there's increasingly a fear of shortages. There's real anxieties about food supply.
It was these anxieties that resulted in the Tsar's initial reluctance to fully commit to war plans.
It's worth bearing in mind that the Tsar's regime had almost been toppled in a previous war, the ill-fated War of 1904-1905 against Japan. So in 1914, the Tsar wasn't the guiding light of Russian foreign policy. At one level, it was a matter of geopolitical calculation. Serbia was Russia's closest client state in the Balkans, and had Russia not supported Serbia in this crisis, it would have essentially forfeited the Balkans as a sphere of influence to Germany and to Austria-Hungary. Secondly, for Russian leaders, it was a matter of honor or a matter of credibility.
Sazonov told the Council of Ministers, "If Russia fails to fulfill her historic mission, she will henceforth have to take second place among the powers."
When Russia and Serbia began to say, actually, we're going to stand firm on this point, when Austria-Hungary actually wants to punish Serbia, when Germany comes to Austria's aid, that the Western powers really begin to appreciate the magnitude of what has gone on and what is actually going to happen here when all these states, all these war plans, all these troop movements begin to actually fall into place.
The British Prime Minister told his king, "The Austrian ultimatum is the gravest event of many years past in European politics, as it may be the prelude to a war."
The July crisis did not have to end in a world war. There were numerous exit ramps. None of these options were taken because the costs of taking those options were considered too high. It would have required one side to accept defeat and the other side to savor victory.
On July 26th, 10 days before the start of the war, the Serbian Prime Minister presented his government's response to the ultimatum. "Part of your demands we have accepted," he said. "For the rest, we place our hopes on your loyalty and chivalry." But the Kaiser was notoriously capricious.
He vacillated between war and peace, and in this crisis he did the same. But there was also a very personal dimension to this crisis for William II. He had an unusually friendly relationship with the Archduke, and so the murder of the Archduke affected William II not only in a political way, but also in a personal sense.
40 minutes after receiving Serbia's reply, the train carrying Austria's ambassador, his family, and his entire legation crossed the Serbian border, pausing at the border to wire to Vienna the news that diplomatic relations had been severed. At 11:10 a.m. on Tuesday, the 28th of July, the Austro-Hungarian declaration of war was delivered. The Royal Serbian government, not having answered in a satisfactory manner the note of July 23, 1914, presented by the Austro-Hungarian minister at Belgrade, the imperial and royal government consequently considers herself henceforward in a state of war with Serbia.
It's always struck me as ironic that really having caused the war in the Balkans, the Austro-Hungarians really had little idea as to what they were going to do next. They were improvising, and any idea of long-term strategy really went out of the window from very early on.
This was not yet the World War, but who would stop the dominoes from falling? Russian Foreign Minister Sazonov cabled his ambassador in Berlin, "In consequence of the declaration of war by Austria against Serbia, the imperial government will announce tomorrow the mobilization in the military conscriptions of Odessa, Kiev, Moscow, and Kazan."
The Russian mobilization had a decisive impact on the crisis in July 1914. German security depended on Germany's own rapid mobilization. Secondly, the Russian mobilization also restricted the room for diplomatic negotiation because it heightened the military threat. And thirdly, and critically, it allowed German leaders to depict themselves as acting defensively and therefore to rally public opinion in Germany to their side when Germany decided to initiate war in late July 1914.
The First World War entailed a mobilization of around 14 million men. They mobilized pretty much all of the active male Russian population.
Elsewhere, the decision to commit to war was still unclear. One of the ministers present said of the British cabinet meeting called to discuss the situation, "It was decided not to decide."
This ambiguity was partly due to the nature of constitutional government in Britain. Britain could not declare war unless Parliament approved, and at that point, Parliament was dominated by the governing Liberal Party. Many Liberals were unsure whether they wanted to go to war.
American President Wilson's special envoy in Europe, Colonel House, reported that the situation is extraordinary. It is jingoism run stark mad.
The United States was still deeply enthralled to its more than century-long tradition by that point of neutrality. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, the founders of the Republic, essentially had declared neutrality in the face of other European conflicts. And the United States, the core element of its geostrategic strategy was isolationism, not to get itself involved in conflicts beyond the North American continent.
News of the Russian mobilization reached Berlin on the morning of July 31st. By lunchtime, the declaration of Kriegsgefahr, imminent state of war, had been made. By mid-afternoon, Germany had sent Russia an ultimatum. On the 1st of August, the German ambassador to St. Petersburg presented the document that made Germany's case, asserting that German attempts at conciliation had been rebuffed. The statement concluded by saying, "The German Empire accepts the challenge and considers himself at war with Russia." It was in Brussels that the last act of the drama was played out, when the German ambassador arrived to see the French foreign minister. Reliable information has been received by the German government to the effect that French forces intend to march on the line of the Meuse. It is essential for the self-defense of Germany that she should anticipate any hostile attack. There was no such information. There was a strategy, the Schlieffen Plan, devised in 1905, that required German forces to advance into France through neutral Belgium, a strategy that would force Britain's hand.
The Schlieffen Plan, as it's called, means that you have to go through Belgium, which means that the British come in. And so, tactically and operationally, it's a very interesting and striking plan. At a political and diplomatic level, it's absolutely disastrous.
It had been a fundamental principle of British foreign policy going back 300 years that you do not allow the Low Countries, Belgium and the Netherlands, to fall into the hands of an enemy, particularly not if they have a powerful fleet, because that would imperil British security.
The German ambassador in Paris performed his last act. He delivered a sealed envelope. He spoke of attacks on German soil by French aircraft, which had not taken place, and the declaration of war against France. The allegation that French aircraft had attacked Nuremberg was false, as was the stunt in 1939 that claimed Polish troops had attacked a radio transmitter at Gleiwitz. Two lies, separated by 25 years, to give aggression a sham legality. Nonetheless, the match was struck as the world prepared for war. At 8:02 a.m. on Tuesday, August 4th, 1914, the first German units crossed the Belgian frontier at Gemmenich.
The invasion of Belgium played a role, animosity in Britain, and Germany had then to face a far superior combination. They sought an escalation, including France and Russia. It's fine, we will win that. And probably they were even correct with this assessment. Britain being in changed the picture.
A further hindrance was that Germany and Austria-Hungary would have to start the war without one of its own allies.
Italy declares a position of neutrality in August of 1914. Italy had deemed Austria to be the aggressor in its waging of war against Serbia, and the Triple Alliance was a defensive military pact. So Italy did not feel it needed to declare war at that point and enter the war on the side of its allies, Germany and Austria-Hungary. What's very important to say when thinking about this period of Italian neutrality, which goes from August of 1914 to May of 1915, is that there was not a majority support within the Italian population for entry into the war. The vast majority of the Italian population wanted Italy to remain neutral and did not see that Italy had anything to gain from entering this European war.
Winston Churchill asked Sir Edward Grey, "What happens now?" And the Foreign Secretary told him, "Now we shall send them an ultimatum to stop the invasion of Belgium within 24 hours." The American ambassador in London asked Grey, "Does Britain expect Germany to bow to your ultimatum?" "No. Of course everybody knows there will be a war," Grey said, and according to memoirs, spoke the one line for which he is still remembered. "Thus the efforts of a lifetime go for nothing," Grey said. "The lamps are going out all over Europe. We shall not see them lit again in our lifetime."
So I think that when people look back to the period before the First World War, before 1914, as what they used to call the Belle Époque, the beautiful period, the period of stability and prosperity. There wasn't prosperity of everyone by any means. It wasn't completely imaginary, and the big change comes with the impact of the First World War.
Then the World War, the surprising thing is that the Serbian issue, which started it, did not play a role, or took the back seat, because then Germany, as a stronger partner, was immediately in the focus of the Entente powers of Britain, France, and Russia.
And so nations, or the few men who led the nations, started a fight. Adolf Hitler remembered, "I fell to my knees and thanked heaven from an overflowing heart that it had granted me the good fortune to be alive at such a time." The Great War had begun.
The war that broke out in 1914 is a popular war, in that once societies get over the initial shock of the fact they are at war, they agree with, support, and are willing to do their bit, ultimately to sacrifice their lives in some cases, for the national cause.
Germany's assault through neutral Belgium implemented the Schlieffen Plan, Germany's tactical solution for avoiding a two-front war with France and Russia.
Alfred von Schlieffen had finalized his Schlieffen Plan by 1905, that the German army would strike out in the west against France in a short, swift operation, and then throw all its might to the Eastern Front and grapple with Russia.
France was very much aware that Germany was going to attack. They anticipated a German advance through Belgium and had developed not an offensive plan of their own, but more accurately a counter-offensive plan that was the essential principle of French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre's Plan 17, as it was called, was to wait and see, to gather reports on where German forces were located, find a weak point, and then send the mass of the French army's reserves to strike at that weak point of the German army. Unfortunately, Joffre had made a major miscalculation about the strength of the German forces that were going to be launched against France.
"No one can say my colleagues in the cabinet are not courageous," said Lord Kitchener, Britain's most famous soldier. "They have no army, and they declared war against the mightiest military nation in the world."
Lord Kitchener shocked his cabinet colleagues, and indeed some people in the country, by declaring the war was going to be a long one. It's going to last for at least 3 years.
He also said he would need 1 million men. He was wrong. 1 million was not enough, and neither was 3 years. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith urged the House of Commons, "Let us now make sure that all the resources, not only of the United Kingdom, but of the vast empire of which it is the center, shall be thrown into the scale."
Britain's expeditionary force of 4 infantry divisions and 2 cavalry divisions, about 120,000 men, deploy to France in August of 1914 and are attached to the French left. They are quite a small and fragile force that is going to support the French, who are going to fight the main battles.
A German counterattack on the 20th forced separate battles on the French armies. During the 22nd, the right flank was attacked and driven back 25 kilometers.
In total, the German army was a strong one, also in terms of numbers and in terms of military efficiencies, probably the best army in Europe. The French army was very good, but it had a much smaller pool of manpower.
That day, 27,000 French soldiers were killed, more than any nation had ever lost in a single day of battle, more than Britain would lose on the first day of the Somme. To the west, the Schlieffen Plan was unraveling. Liège, German military planners explained, was to be overrun on the 12th day, conceded by a small Belgian army that would not fight. In the event, the Belgians fought bravely, and Twelfth Night came and went. And with Russia moving more quickly than had been anticipated, the German High Command began nervously changing the disposition of troops.
The rapid Russian advance that no one had expected at the beginning of the war enabled the Russians to occupy Habsburg Galicia, the Polish-speaking parts of the Habsburg Empire.
The might and breadth of the Russian army had overwhelmed the Germans. But not for long. Pritwitz, commanding the 8th Army, considered falling back behind the Vistula and was replaced. An old general named Hindenburg was brought out of retirement and given as his chief of staff an up-and-comer named Ludendorff.
Hindenburg is a very experienced, solid general, and he doesn't panic. And it's his relationship with Ludendorff which is particularly profitable. Ludendorff is described as a constantly mobile intellect, a man who is very good at getting things done, very energetic. And with Hindenburg, there's a sort of grandfatherly sense of concern that he has for Ludendorff, and able to calm him down, keep him going at certain moments.
In the east, a lack of coordination between 2 Russian armies moving into Prussia, and poor leadership, and even poorer equipment, helped the Germans defeat each Russian force separately.
In 1914, it is widely expected that the so-called Russian steamroller, slow-moving but vast numbers of troops, will sweep to victory in the east against the Germans, the Austrians. It doesn't happen like that.
The Eastern Front was more than 1,000 miles long, so it was an incredibly vast land area to deal with. Not only was it long, though, it was also a highly mobile front. So unlike the Western Front, which was often in quite static trench warfare situations, the Eastern Front was often very mobile, so that troops moved forward and backward rapidly. So this is really important, and the reason it's important is because it puts enormous strain on Russia's infrastructure and networks. So they need to move resources and people to these frontline areas, but they don't actually have a particularly strong either transport network in that region of the empire, and they also don't have particularly strong communications infrastructure. So this is one of the challenges for the Eastern Front for Russia.
A Russian army was defeated at the Masurian Lakes, another, the army of Alexander Samsonov, at Tannenberg.
The Germans win a stunning victory at Tannenberg, which in effect stops the Russian advance dead.
The completeness of his army's defeat led Samsonov to commit suicide.
Actually brings Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the two most successful German generals of the First World War, to public notice for the first time.
By mid-September, Austrian forces, which had opened fronts in the Balkans and on Russia's southern flank, were in retreat. Their official history registering a complaint that would be much repeated in the Second World War. The artillery sinking in up to their axles in the morass that the roads became.
The Austro-Hungarians went from effectively being equals to Germany in this military endeavor to being very much dependent on Germany. It was a massive blow to the prestige of the Habsburg Empire, and it marked the extent to which Habsburg military force had really declined across the 19th century.
In the west, the Germans were held at the Marne, where famously General Joseph Gallieni, commanding the defense of Paris, commandeered trains and trucks to rush reinforcements to the front.
Essentially, the German army that encountered French troops on the Marne was now facing a bigger army, an army that had been able to replace its casualties that it had suffered in the early battles on the frontiers with trained men from French reserve depots. On the other hand, the German army was becoming overstretched. The forces had been marching for 2 weeks in hot early autumn weather. They hadn't been able to replenish manpower and munitions in the way that the French armies had. And what was demonstrated in the Marne was the resilience and the fighting power of mass armies. The immediate threat, the possibility of defeat in a short war was over, and France would now have to engage in the long war that ultimately was the only war that France could win against Germany.
Shortly after the battle, German Crown Prince Wilhelm told an American reporter, "We have lost the war. It will go on for a long time, but lost it is already."
Tomorrow, you could be brutally attacked by an out-of-control lawnmower.